Welcome, everyone. My name is Nate Weisenberg. I'm a program associate at AAAS, and thank you for joining this Ask Me Anything session with Rhiannan Price. So we're really grateful to Rhiannan for taking the time to be with us today. So before we get started, and I'll turn the microphone over to her in just a moment, I just wanted to go over a couple of the ground rules. So this session will be approximately 60 minutes. So Rhiannan will begin by introducing herself and sharing some brief opening remarks about the topic of the session, which is career pathways in human rights and humanitarian response in the private sector. And then after that, we'll keep the floor open for questions. We'll try to keep this pretty informal. Maybe what I think might make sense is you can just go ahead and type your questions in the chat box at any point. And then when we get to them, we can call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask the question using your microphone. That way we can maybe have a little more interaction that way. Optional, but I think that might be a fun way to do it. So just usual Zoom etiquette. If you are not asking a question, we ask that you just please keep your mic on mute. So just in case there's any background noise, so it doesn't interfere with the presentation. So thank you all again for joining us. And now I'll pass the mic to Rhiannan. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Nate, and big thanks to AAAS for hosting me for the AMA. I'm really glad to be here with you guys. So by way of introduction, my name is Rhiannan Price, and I am, yes, practicing in the private sector, but I feel like I've had kind of a foot in both the public sector and private sector worlds kind of over the scope of my career. Trained my background, or what I claim to be my background, I guess, is a blend of human rights, humanitarian assistance, and applications of technology. and there's been kind of over my career, I've had an interesting kind of trajectory there where one thing has kind of naturally led me to another. And ultimately, I think I've had some really kind of diverse experiences across the human rights spectrum and the technology spectrum and kind of how those intersect. So just to share maybe a little bit in terms of my background and how I'm connected with AAAS and kind of the role that I'm doing now. Currently, I'm actually working at a consultancy in the private sector. So I work for a firm called DevGlobal Partners. We specialize in kind of inclusive sustainable development and technology and working with clients who are really kind of operating at kind of the cutting edge of those two. So we work with groups like Gates Foundation and World Bank and the UN and kind of the traditional stakeholders, but we also work a lot with kind of big tech companies, groups like Microsoft, even Starbucks and others in terms of what they're doing around their use of technology for sustainable development. And a lot of that still has today, I think, a really important kind of human rights dimension to it. And that's really where I'm kind of coming from most recently is prior to joining kind of the consulting world, I had been leading the sustainable development practice at Maxar Technologies, which is formerly DigitalGlobe, in case folks are familiar with the kind of remote sensing Earth observation world. So, but if you're not, formerly DigitalGlobe, now Maxar Technologies is one of the kind of leading satellite imagery providers in the world. So they own and operate their own constellation of very high resolution satellites that are imaging the world all over. And so my job and kind of role there was taking Maxar technology and services, so essentially satellite imagery, and figuring out how that applied and could move the needle in terms of the sustainable development goals, including everything around kind of human rights. And I was getting to tell Nate a little bit earlier in terms of part of what I loved about that job and kind of my role there was I not only got to kind of go back to where, my training has been, which is around kind of human rights and understanding those perspectives, but also kind of understanding human rights across the sustainable development goals as well. So for instance, understanding kind of human rights and environmental activism or human rights in global health, which I think is very timely today as well. And so we got to work with, in that capacity, I got to work again with kind of what I'll say the traditional stakeholders are in the human rights field. So groups like AAAS, who were definitely taking advantage of our technology and still are in a lot of ways, with the ICC and some of the other projects that they're doing, but as well as working with groups like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or others who are using the imagery to actually, in some cases, document human rights abuses. And there's some pretty incredible stories from that I'm happy to share. But in a lot of cases too, actually leveraging those technology, satellite imagery, artificial intelligence, crowdsourcing, these types of things to actually do more predictive analytics as well around human rights. So a lot of what I was doing was really kind of trying to be, it was both art and science, right? In terms of trying to understand kind of the technical requirements as well as the community needs and kind of do some solutioneering between the two, with an eye, of course, to a lot of times the sustainability factors and the scalability factors that are really important. And so that's kind of been my recent career. But in terms of my kind of early training and experiences, I did my master's at University of Denver at the Corbell School. So I've got to give a shout out to one of my professors is here. One of my former professors, Louis Esparza. So hi to Louis, and so glad that you're here. And you'll probably hear hallmarks of a lot of the things that you taught me and that we learned together kind of over the years at DU. And so that was a really great experience, especially from kind of a human rights perspective, because it was actually the catalyst for me, because at the time when I was in grad school, I won a Boren Fellowship to go learn Swahili in East Africa. And at the time, when I was working in East Africa, I was also doing a lot of work with NGOs on the ground, not only learning language, but applying that in a kind of a human rights context. So one of the NGOs I worked with was actually using technology to try to do a kind of justice and reconciliation barometer across all of Uganda following the Lord's Resistance Army conflict, the LRA conflict, and then advocating for victims and survivors through that. And so that was really kind of my first foray in terms of kind of bringing the technology piece into what I was thinking already of around humanitarian assistance, around human rights and development in some of these paradigms. And so that's really, I think, where the technology focus came in for me. And it was really a kind of baptism by fire, so to speak, in terms of, working in a field office in northern Uganda with, where I was the kind of only one of 2 expats on staff, which was awesome. So it was very locally driven, locally owned, and really kind of plugging in to help take technology to the next level and kind of be able to scale it. And so I had to, as kind of the kind of de facto lead on that effort at the time, had to learn a lot in terms of, open source mapping tools, for instance, that were going to be scalable and sustainable for the NGO, and how do you make things more dynamic and do some of the storytelling that we know is so important today, especially from a kind of traditional geospatial or GIS perspective for human rights and the like. So yeah, I'll kind of pause there. That's a little bit of an intro to me and kind of my career arc there, but I'm very much looking forward to the AMA. So I want to open it up for any and all questions and just kind of start to jump in.
Wonderful, thank you. And if folks have questions, they can type them in the chat box. We also have the raise hand feature, so please feel free to use that too. Maybe while folks are thinking of questions, if I can take sort of I'm quasi-moderator, if I can take that privilege. You mentioned some stories. Like, is there one of them that you'd like to share that you think has been really resonant for you, has really stayed with you?
Oh yeah, for sure. And this is a story. There are a few that are more recent, I think, but this is a story that I think resonates for a lot of reasons, including the kind of at the end of the day, the impact. So this is when I first joined DigitalGlobe, actually. So this was back in 2015. We were approached by some journalists from the Associated Press at the time. So specifically Martha Mendoza and her team. And she reached out because she and the AP were doing this investigation throughout Southeast Asia into illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, IUU fishing. And IUU fishing vis-a-vis human trafficking and kind of human rights abuses. And so she had been following throughout kind of this investigation. Her and the team had collected some really incredible, on the ground intelligence in terms of, these fishing vessels, what the standards were and things like that. And so they had a suspicion based on the kind of reporting that there was likely going to be what they called a transshipment in this particular area of what they call the dogleg, which is this body of water kind of in between Papua New Guinea and Thailand, I guess. And so they had some intelligence that in this general area of the ocean, there was likely going to be this handoff, this transshipment, where one vessel that was kind of an illegal vessel or an unauthorized one was going to offload its catch that it was likely illegal, offload this illegal catch onto another vessel that could then, because this vessel was registered, could actually take that catch into port and then start selling it. And you can imagine just from a supply chain standpoint, it's all sorts of problematic in terms of sustainable seafood and the like. But really where the AP was coming from at the time was around kind of the human rights angle, because they had been hearing these reports of essentially, what it comes down to kind of modern day slavery and having actually folks on these vessels for years and years and years who were not being compensated, whose families weren't hearing from them, and so on. And so as the kind of satellite imagery company, they approached us and asked, would you be willing to take some images over this part of the ocean, because we suspect this kind of transshipment activity is going to happen, and that's the evidence that we really need to kind of blow the lid on this case, and really intervene. And so we took a chance at the time, because as you can imagine, imaging the ocean is kind of like imaging a needle in a haystack, right? But because we had this guidance from the reporters and journalists, we could do a little bit more targeted collections. And so we started to collect over this area, and lo and behold, I mean, it took us a few shots, but lo and behold, we got this incredible image, and I wish I had it to show you guys, because I get goosebumps every time I tell the story still, years later. We got this incredible image, and you can actually see this pretty big trawler. The vessel is open. You can see them actually hooked onto this other vessel, starting to unload this catch. And the beauty of this is, because of the detail in the imagery, one, you're able to easily identify what that vessel is. So we could actually tell this is the Silver Sea 2, and it's not registered in any of these ports and things like that. So that was a big game changer. Transshipments unto themselves are good proxies for illegal activity. And so it was really kind of the evidence, so to speak, or at least, good enough that the AP needed to kind of incentivize some action from the Thai authorities, who actually sent their Navy to intercept these ships. And as a result of that, because of this investigation, they freed over 2,000 enslaved fishermen who had been stuck on this vessel and other vessels as part of this trafficking ring, some of whom hadn't been on land in over 15 years. They just keep them out at sea and just do these transshipments. And so, if they don't need to kind of fuel up and things like that. And so it's just this incredible story of showing what, from my perspective as kind of the technologist at the time, appreciating where kind of high tech meets what I will call kind of analog approaches, and why those are so important to kind of work in conjunction, but also showing that, the power of satellite imagery to spur action, whether it's, intervening in terms of IUU fishing and human trafficking and human rights abuses, or if it's something like climate change, right, and incentivizing behavior change around that. So that particular AP investigation is one of the stories that I just love to tell. And that group in particular, they won the Pulitzer actually that year for their investigation. So it was just really incredible, and has since led to the ratification of important policies, both by the US as well as a number of international groups around traceability and things like that too, which was just a really fantastic, I think, byproduct of what they were hoping for. So.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I see that that Lewis has a question in the chat box. So Lewis, go ahead. You can go ahead and ask your question over video if you'd like.
Okay, hi everybody. I have myself on mute before because I got the washing machine going and I've got like people cutting trees over here, so I apologize if there's a lot of ambient noise.
It's
It's
just
great.
life, Lewis. We're totally with you. That's just life. You know, Nate and I were saying there's going to be dogs, there'll be babies. Hopefully there'll be all those things during the AMA as well.
Yeah, and it's great to see you. I haven't seen your face in like 10 years or so. I don't know, a very long time. So
Too
it's
long,
really,
yeah.
so it's great. It's great to see you. The question I typed in here is, what do you think that current students could, I teach. So what do you think that current students could do to prepare for a successful career in humanitarian assistance? So, you're a great model for, somebody who goes from studying this stuff to actually like doing it. So how did you do it? And if you could speak now to like somebody who was in your shoes, even when you were an undergraduate, what would you do, or what would you tell them to do to prepare them to do what you're doing, and not just to do it, but to excel at it as you do?
Yes, well, great question, Lewis. And I think I would answer it in a few different ways. And some of the best advice that I got when I was in grad school was actually from Jack Donnelly, around, who's the kind of led the human rights program there, around how, human rights, it's so diffusive in terms of being applicable to all of these walks of life and all of these facets in terms of other disciplines and things like that. And I think that's true, not only in terms of kind of cross-sectoral, it applies in terms of human rights are mission critical to things like we talked about already, like healthcare, or around environmental justice, or around human trafficking or supply chains, and you name it. But also that there's a big world out there in terms of what private sector is doing, and I think more so these days in more meaningful ways around human rights. And so that, to me, when I got that kind of advice or that perspective initially, I didn't know quite what to do with it, because I feel like my training at that point had been very kind of biased. It had been, focused in kind of the public sector and what NGOs do in the context of human rights. And it was really also coming at it from more of a kind of a philosophical background too, having studied that as an undergrad. And so getting out of, I think, grad school and being exposed, especially through some of the kind of different technologies that we were using, to all of these disparate stakeholders that touch on human rights, for me was really important. And I would encourage everybody, especially students, to just really seek out that kind of diversity of experiences. So if you're interested, especially in this kind of intersection of human rights and technology, even that is a huge world that's out there, right? So I come at it from kind of a satellite imagery perspective and geospatial technologies these days, which is one part of that community. But there's so many exciting things that I think are happening in terms of, particularly when you think about human rights and AI, and you think about human rights and digital inclusion and internet access and some of those things. So I think there's all these different disciplines even within that intersection that I think students should explore and expose yourself to, especially because I think it makes you stronger as a human rights thinker and practitioner to have those kind of different perspectives and understand where these stakeholders come at it. Because I think where Microsoft, for instance, is doing a lot in human rights and where they have kind of leadership buy-in, that's a very different beast than, let's say what, Amnesty is doing in terms of their work. And so I think that would be my biggest advice to students in terms of whether it's humanitarian assistance or human rights. I think it applies in similar ways of again, just kind of expose yourself to everything that's out there, because it's a really dynamic world, especially from the kind of technology perspective. And the one thing that I've noticed, especially coming from a company, that focuses on, satellite imagery, of course, is a big cohort of our kind of stakeholders. We're government, but specifically kind of defense and intelligence. And I think that's also really important for us. While we might not have as many kind of inroads to that community given kind of our training or where we focused in terms of our experiences, it's still really mission critical, I think, to understand the priorities of that community vis-a-vis some of these subjects, because they are investing in these areas in big ways, and especially from a technology standpoint, a lot of the technologies coming out of defense and intelligence then later matriculate and are adopted by, other humanitarians and human rights practitioners. So I'd also, try to break down our silos from that perspective to say, even if it doesn't jive with your personal theory of change or what you believe to be the right way to move the needle, I think it's still really important to understand where all these folks are coming from and kind of what their frames are when they approach some of these questions too. Good question, Liz.
Well, I'll ask another question if nobody else is going to ask a question. Although I think, there's 16 people here. So I don't know many of you, but somebody should ask, you got Rhiannan Price here from, which is a good resource for you. And I don't even know who you are, but you probably could learn something. So anyway, Rhiannan, it sounds like you, not just students, but you're also saying that like maybe researchers or faculty could do some more to not be just in the ivory tower, but also like teach and perhaps learn about some of the other stakeholders that you mentioned, aside from simply, international treaties from the middle of the 20th century and et cetera, and which is important, of course, but not the whole story. So how do you think, what's a good way, do you think, for researchers who are at least open to that to begin to sort of bridge that gap between what academics are doing in human rights and what the private sector is doing in human rights?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question as well. I think to some extent, I think, in terms of kind of research questions, right? And I think where academics are focusing, having some kind of understanding of, the applied research perspective, right? And what would it mean to, take your theory or take your research and actually apply it? Does it mean you're working with activists? Does it mean you're working with companies? Does it mean you're working with technologists? Because I think that's kind of, that next level of detail could kind of open up your thinking to understand who would I want to actually collaborate with. And in my mind, that's in a lot of times where I see the academics that we work with, especially both in the consulting world now, as well as when I was at Maxar, that's kind of where they tend to fall down, is not having enough line of sight as to how to execute or having those connections already. And that's not to say that that's your role per se, but I think it makes the research stronger, right? Or and we come in kind of the technology and development fields right now. There's this big push around human-centered design, right? And I think that kind of concept makes a lot of sense, especially when you're trying to bridge the gap between what, let's say, is coming out of academia versus what the private sector is doing. And to be fair, I think when you talk about the private sector too, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that that's a very diverse ecosystem unto itself, right? So you've got actors like the big tech companies, and that's kind of, one part of that. And they operate and have priorities that are perhaps different than, other companies, let's say like Maxar or DigitalGlobe, that are more kind of data providers into the ecosystem, versus, when you talk about more of the kind of startups or social enterprise and things like that, that also make a private sector. So I think that's where, where I've seen some of the kind of best research is where they're actually pulling in some of these experts, whether it's from private sector or from NGOs or other areas outside of academia, to kind of pressure test some of those assumptions, right? And I think a lot of this for me, when I've been exposed to folks from different backgrounds, it really kind of unearths some of my own assumptions and bias that I'm kind of baking into what I do. And so I think that's just also really helpful in terms of, how you approach this discipline in particular, because there's so many kind of facets that come into play. I also think, though, from that kind of perspective of understanding the diversity of the private sector, it is also important to kind of understand, I mentioned incentives, the incentives that they have, right? And I think especially if you are trying to kind of translate, I'll say, research into action, right? And I think there's been a lot of traction recently around kind of human rights analyses, humanitarian assistance when it comes to especially supply chains, right? Because there's these big commitments right now from tech companies, and a lot of investment firms especially have been really focused on what I will call are the kind of like environmental social governance indicators, right? And a lot of that's born out of corporate social responsibility paradigms. But today I think it's taking, there's what I would say is there's kind of renewed interest there in the private sector side. And I think plenty of opportunities for students, researchers, others to better plug in, because so many of these companies, while they're making these commitments, don't necessarily know how to get there, right? And the getting there necessitates, I think, really robust research and really robust thinking that a lot of times is housed in universities and with the kind of mind share that we've got on the call today too. So hopefully that helps.
I'd love to jump in and ask a question. This may not be in your realm of expertise, but perhaps it's sort of two separate questions. One is, how often do you work with multispectral or hyperspectral data, and how do you use it like in your field, as well as like solving some human rights related violations? And then second is, I think that the border and like people dying at the borders, like U.S.-Mexico border crossing, and I wonder if you've seen anything that relates hyperspectral imaging with trying to locate people that have like not made it to Arizona in the process of crossing the border, and whether you've seen that being used to identify missing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great question. So I'm not necessarily, so I will say I'm not a remote sensing expert, but I can talk about some of the applications I've seen, Helena, and in terms of multispectral, I'll talk about multispectral a little bit different than I will hyperspectral, because we, at least at Maxar, didn't have hyperspectral in our sensors. It was just into superspectral. So like, you know, the dozens. So, and for folks who are maybe unfamiliar, what we're talking about are kind of like, you know, the bands or the wavelengths that are imaged from a remote sensing perspective. So you have some satellites as well as other sensors who can capture, you know, into the infrared, near infrared, and those kinds of things that we can't see with the human eye. And those have a whole array of applications that are quite a bit different than just kind of what you can see from the red, green, blue, the optical things that you can see, right? Where, and that, just so folks are familiar, kind of what you would see in, let's say, Google Earth, that is mostly, I would say, like RGB imagery. It does have some of the kind of multispectral within it, of course, but what you're seeing is more of a kind of a reference layer. But there's so much rich information in those pixels in kind of multispectral, hyperspectral imagery that can be used to you know, unlock all sorts of things like plant health or vegetation health or water saturation or depth, or you name it. So it's just for context for folks on this question. But in terms of kind of multispectral applications, we had a lot at Maxar, but they tended to fall more so in the kind of environmental, agricultural buckets, I would say. And those are applications like understanding things like crop health, like a lot of the things that I said. So understanding kind of crop health or land use, land cover, because you can only derive those types of analyses from what we call the spectral signatures that are given off from the imagery, right? So in kind of near infrared, you know, things that are healthier vegetation, for instance, will show up as red versus some of the other colors. And that's just kind of one dimension to start to tease those things out. From a human rights perspective, there's, I would say, pretty limited application of multispectral and hyperspectral for a number of reasons. I think one, I think there's been kind of limited capacity to some degree in terms of from the kind of spectral analysis side, because that necessitates different capabilities than just annotating imagery, let's say, or using it as kind of a base map or crowdsourcing, which are some of the, I would say, more kind of basic use cases. And those are types of things where I think human rights practitioners a lot of times will use imagery as kind of context or a reference layer alongside other data and other kind of ancillary inputs. But one of the things that we did was actually trying to use multispectral to understand mass burial sites and things like that. So where displaced earth had happened. And so to some extent, when you're just kind of looking at an imagery with your eye, you can maybe start to tell, especially if you're a trained analyst, where earth has been displaced and things like that. But with multispectral, you can start to very quickly see like, oh, this is clearly, has been compressed from, tire tracks and displaced earth and things like that. Or, there had been a certain kind of vegetation and this signature now is very different. So we know there's been, especially kind of change over time if you have a series of images. And especially now, I would say in the context of the pandemic, part of what we were doing in MXR2 was not only using kind of imagery to understand where kind of burial sites were, but trying to actually do these mortality estimates out of that because so many countries are not sharing that data, right? And there's kind of a need to some extent to be able to understand that. So that's kind of one example, Helena. And there's some others that we did, particularly in terms of the example you point out of documenting human rights abuses where like in Myanmar, for instance, with the Rohingya crisis, we were imaging a lot of those communities. So we not only had kind of evidence that communities were being actually burned down, and that's also part of the spectral signature, and the multispectral really kind of differentiates that in a very stark way. But also then later on, we could evidence the fact that they were bulldozing over those burned communities to try then cover up the evidence. So those are just a few examples. In terms of hyperspectral though, there just hasn't been as much application from hyperspectral. And I think a lot of that is because there's limitations of the availability of hyperspectral at the kind of spatial resolution that human rights practitioners really need. So I would say there's a technology limitation there more so. And that, and that said, I know that there are actors, particularly in kind of the, satellite imagery providers, as well as space agencies like NASA and JAXA and ESA, who are kind of pushing the envelope of hyperspectral, especially from spaceborne hyperspectral, because there is quite a bit of work that happens of, like cameras that have hyperspectral and things like that. But that, of course, is a limitation of you've got to be on the ground, you have to be, capturing it in real time and that kind of thing. So I haven't seen very much application of hyperspectral for human rights, and I especially haven't seen it for the use case that you mentioned either, Helena, around the kind of displacement and migration and things like that. But that's not to say that it couldn't be an application. I just think you'd run into some scalability issues and probably also some like cost effectiveness questions along the way just because of that limitations.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I did a little bit of research on that, and the best thing I could find is a researcher in California has like put together like hyperspectral samples of like blood on different clothings and things that could like resonate with like bone samples to be able to identify it. But yeah it seemed like it was the lack of technology to be able to get like what you said, the spatial resolution, and then the pricing. So I was curious if you had run across anything different. But thank you. This is really like the Rohingya thing. I'd never thought about that, and it very good application.
Yeah, well, and I think that whole, what you were just kind of referencing, the whole what I call like the digital forensics field within human rights is super exciting right now, and I think that's where especially hyperspectral has come into play even more so these days. So we'll be curious to see where it goes too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Don't be shy, guys. I mean, if you've got your zinger questions, throw them out there too.
I'll ask another question while people are thinking. Okay. And this is not a soft, this won't be a softball question because maybe I don't want people to think that I'm biased or anything, even though I am. But I work in a public university. And a lot of the people who I know who work on human rights, who are academics mostly, or NGOs, and my students are, very skeptical of sometimes of, non-public or private approaches. How how do you, how would you, I don't know if I'm asking exactly for advice on how to deal with that, but more like how would you enter into, how would you engage with that? Because it seems like my hunch is that more can be done by dialogue and finding points of commonality than to, you know, emphasize what are surely differences.
Mhm.
But you know, how would you approach a conversation like that?
Mhm. Yeah, to be fair, Louis, I feel like I've avoided folks like that who have that kind of perspective because I found it so limiting in terms of how what we could do together. But that's not necessarily fair. And so, yeah, I think kind of my point there, or how we could potentially kind of collectively do a little bit of a shift is, again, I think understanding and having more folks that, if possible, have experiences in both public and private sector helps immensely. Because again, I think a lot of it is just kind of unfamiliarity, with the other side, so to speak, in terms of absolutely within the private sector, there, are, actors whose incentives are not going to be aligned with yours, or whose ultimately objectives are going to be perhaps counter to what you want to pursue. And I think that's something to acknowledge. And that's where I think a lot of the bias comes into play. That said, I think there's a whole remaining part of the ecosystem where there are good actors. And I think there are folks who, even within some of these like large companies, for instance, who we kind of, would put in that category of being problematic or, like competitive in terms of their intellectual property or what have you, antithetical to how we would want to operate as a human rights community. I think even within those organizations, there could be, champions or stewards who are good linkages, who can help even within that organization kind of change the paradigm. And so I kind of give that context to start with, but I think it's important to show that, even in within academia, it's important to understand their perspectives and where those, again, incentives are. But I think it's important for us in the private sector to acknowledge all of the strengths of where those researchers are coming from, right? And so I think there's a little bit of, kind of bridging that chasm, both in terms of how we talk about things, because there's definitely a language, what I will call is a language barrier between public and private sector, especially I think on human rights issues, but I think on a lot of other issues in terms of we might be, approaching things similarly, but from a, different nomenclature, different paradigm, those kind of things. So, and I would kind of, if I were the kind of academic in this standpoint, I think I would raise up those of my peers who have done this well. And I can think of a lot of researchers and students as well, who we worked closely with when I was at Maxar, who we love to work with because they also understood the funding landscape too, which I think is another kind of key piece, and maybe another way to encourage researchers to start to question their own bias around this, right? Because there's actually a lot of funding potential coming from private sector on some of these questions, right? And I think having that kind of opportunity and perspective means that you can actually bring your research forward. And so maybe it's a matter of kind of sharing some of those pros and cons, and some of the likely benefits of kind of breaking down the silos and starting to work with private sector more. I also think that it's important for us to highlight back to those academics and kind of convince them of there are certain things that you're simply not going to accomplish without having these types of stakeholders involved. So we should get them involved, right? I think it's you could apply this to a lot of other kind of like causes or activism in terms of like from a feminist perspective, you also have to include men. Like if you want to change supply chains in the private sector, it's not just the private sector that's got to do that. They need communities to be part of that. They need researchers to help them understand the models to do this. They need, so I think it's a mix of all of those things, Louis, but it's not an easy task. And it's not necessarily something that I think the private sector prioritizes as much as they should, nor do researchers prioritize that enough as they should. And And I think there's probably a lesson there for those funders, especially the funders outside of those communities, to start to kind of help us come together a little bit more outside of just the kind of talking up public-private partnerships, but doing it a little bit more specifically and in a way that forces people to work together. So you actually can't just get your dollars to do research for research sake. You have to be working as part of a consortium, or you have to be considering the adoption of your research or whatever it is.
So if I may, hi. So I just wanted to build a little bit on that. So I'm actually, I guess I'm a researcher that I personally believe that my research will benefit better if I try to use open source data and open source systems, just because I want to make sure that it's available for organizations that may need it. And those organizations are going to be very small if I want to ensure that it reaches the right target or audience that I want to. So talking about that and also the incentives of I also know that if I cannot provide that ultimate end without trying to, like you said, try to engage the stakeholders. So what is the incentive for like organizations like you were talking about satellite imaging and the ones that you have worked with to support researchers maybe like me, that eventually what I want to do is, ensure that small organizations don't have to end up paying for it, and for me to be able to share the data that I have collected and research on.
Yeah, I think that's also a great question, Perla, and thanks for asking it. I think there's a few things wrapped up in that. I think there's one, points around kind of open source and data licensing and how that unto itself is fit for purpose for whatever you're trying to achieve. Because I think there are cases, and this might not be the case with your research per se, but in my experience, there have been cases where open source is actually detrimental, right? And you don't want things to be open. And I can give you examples of that from a human rights perspective, where we're releasing information too quickly, and it was used by bad actors, in unintentional ways, or in ways that we did not foresee at the time, I should say. But I think you make a great point in terms of sometimes I think there is a tension between kind of data licensing, particularly when it comes to research communities and private sector, where research communities, I think far and away much prefer, especially these days, I would say, to open source things, right? And at least I will say the ones that are about sharing, because I know there's kind of publications and all that kind of good stuff that you guys have to worry about too. But I also think that private sector more and more are starting to figure out, because there is such a push around social good and actually doing meaningful linkages to human rights and other things from companies these days, that they're also starting to get a little bit more savvy in terms of how they do data licensing, right? And this was so much part of my world at Maxar, as you can imagine, from an imagery standpoint, where I thought of open as a spectrum, where in some cases we were at the end of the spectrum in which things were completely open, anybody could use it for any purpose, and kind of open data zealots will say that's true open, right? And maybe that's fair. But more often than not, we were also finding what I like to call kind of the compromise there for us in our commercial interests, which is open for non-commercial purposes, right? Which is a different flavor of that, which I think accounts, and this is, I think, where the incentives and things like that align. So it's the research community coming to the table and saying, we need this to be openly available because we want small NGOs to be able to leverage this, who don't have capacity to buy this stuff, or who don't want to reinvent the wheel and do it again themselves. We also want the research community and students to benefit from this because there are interesting methods here and things that we can build and improve on and all that kind of good stuff, right? So I think there's that piece that needs to then be kind of, balanced with those companies who, especially for those of us in the imagery business, right? That's kind of our core business, right? We're selling imagery. That's where our revenue is coming from. That's where our commercial model is based. So understanding business models and kind of where companies are focused helps to understand where are those kind of potential synergies, right? So for us at Maxar, we did a lot of open for non-commercial, even through our kind of open data program, where we were supporting like disaster response, or even the COVID response recently, that was all released under a Creative Commons open non-commercial license. So I think that, and that's not the only option, right? I think there's, within that kind of open spectrum, there's a lot of different permutations of what that can look like, and a lot of different levers for companies, right? Where perhaps the models that they're developing can stay proprietary, but the derived data itself, that's open. Or, like being able to kind of better sponsor research that they know that research is going to be open. And this is a little bit different than our core products and services that we're selling into the commercial market. So I think there's room for all of that. And as a researcher, again, I think it comes down to, given kind of your research approach and what you're focused on, is there a compromise with the kind of stakeholders that you would want to engage with, where you can say, here would be my ideal requirements from a research perspective, what can we do? I also think there's a lot of kind of really interesting, what I'll call kind of like business models or funding models that can also help address that these days. So, in my last company, we would have, donors or funders, like groups like NASA, for instance, who they would be the kind of funder or purchaser behind the imagery that could then be more openly available to their primary investigators and their research community, and then could kind of share from that ecosystem, right? And so I think there's also that model of, rather than it's a one-to-one kind of sales relationship, right, of imagery company to individual university or individual NGO, there's actually a pooling of resources, so that from an economic standpoint, it makes sense, right? You're finding that sweet spot of the willingness and ability to pay with, the actual cost and things like that, companies have to meet to make this sustainable for themselves too. So I think it's all of those things, Perla, but it's also, tapping into what companies care about in terms of the investor communities that they care about. So like knowing whether or not the group that you're working with, is it a publicly traded company, for instance, that could have a huge effect in terms of what that conversation looks like. Because a lot of those companies are thinking, what do my investors care about? Do they care about these kind of issues? Is there some public relations value for me in terms of opening this data? And a lot of times there is. And it's just a matter of being able to articulate that in a way that resonates with them. And they also, I think, a lot of times get value from, in some cases, bringing on academics and researchers who are domain experts in the things that they care about, to pressure test the work that their experts are doing and kind of work more in conjunction with them too. So just a few, I guess, thoughts on that, but a great question. And I think one that's evolving a lot, especially now.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess, if you're interested in like sharing with us, maybe like who might be in those organizations the right person to start reaching out to. Completely selfish right there.
Yeah, it depends on the organization, right? That's a loaded question, but I might steer you towards this effort that I'm a big fan of. The Gov Lab at NYU has this kind of initiative around what they call data stewards, which I think is a really kind of cool concept. But that is kind of cool, and they've gotten a lot of like named people. So like I used to be one of these in my Maxar capacity, less so today. But they're individuals within companies that have some sort of, I'll say social good, because that's kind of a catch-all, but like some kind of social good or sustainable development or human rights kind of angle to the work that they're supposed to do within the company. And so those are, de facto become kind of the champions or the data stewards, so to speak, to helping unlock some of those corporate assets, particularly for not only research, but, broader communities outside of kind of commercial. And so I definitely check that out for those data stewards through the Gov Lab, because they've also engaged, I think, with a lot of those communities in ways where there might be other names and people like that I don't think of. But if there's like specific companies or organizations or things like that you're interested in, feel free to kick them to me in the chat, or I can give you my contact information. Happy to bandy about some ideas if I know anybody.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, happy to. Leah, I'm just reading your next question. Do you wanna say it out loud?
Yeah, I can. When you were answering Perla's question, you mentioned that you encountered something where you released a software and didn't sort of fully think through some of the implications or whether it was even possible to think through them. Can you talk about what you would have done differently in the situation?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I can give you some specifics on this one too. So it was the instance in particular that I was thinking of was, again, this was a while back, actually, I guess now, this was 2011. But DevGlobal at the time was part of what we called the Satellite Sentinel project. So this was all around the Sudan referendum and monitoring electoral violence at the time. And so it was kind of like, we're watching you from space was George Clooney's big thing, right? Like, so don't, don't attack people and hopefully kind of, actually enable the peace agreements and things like that. So this was kind of the enforcement side of that, I guess. And we were working as a company, we were working closely with Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, who they were kind of building the capacity to essentially take these imagery that we were collecting in near real time off the sensor and annotate it or analyze it and put it into more kind of interpreted, digestible reports that then they were putting out to the community around, the state of the state and what's happening there. Thanks, Nate. And that's a great link too, to check out some of the things that they were doing at the time and also just kind of how imagery played a role. But one of the things that we did, because we were so keen on because it was like this big push on real time, and this was 2011, right? So like having near real time imagery out there was kind of a big deal. So we were very, I think, focused on the like shiny light object piece of the technology and had funding and all these pieces. And what we should have done was, I think, done a little bit more hard work in terms of the kind of design phase, or particularly kind of understanding a do no harm from a do no harm framework standpoint, right? And I think this has been the lesson that, to be fair, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative has run with in a really great way, because what we did is we put out this image that was a junction where I think a bunch of, it was at the time, a Chinese construction company was kind of building infrastructure here. And so the report had kind of called that out, and that there was this junction and it was near some other events that were happening, and it was just referenced. And so the HHI put that out pretty quick, and Enough Project put that out pretty quick. And then it was picked up by folks on the ground. And then those Chinese workers were attacked in a kind of day or two afterward. I'm a little fuzzy on the details again, but where they were actually attacked shortly thereafter, because they had this, the folks on the ground, the militia could actually identify where this particular junction was, even though we didn't in the image say where it was. Just based on local knowledge, they knew. There's not so many of these junctions in rural Sudan, right, at the time. And so that was a big lesson learned for us in terms of, well, maybe it's a matter of, and in that case, maybe it was the time factor, right? Like that we put information out too quickly. Or perhaps it was about really understanding that local knowledge of a satellite image is going to be much richer than what we sitting in our offices in the US can appreciate or think you can glean out of an image, right? So there's all of those things I think that we needed to consider. HHI has since done or what they call I think it's called the Signal Code. I believe it's Signal. I know it's called Signal, but I think it's called the Signal Code. And it's essentially this guide that was born out of that experience of, if you are a technologist, you're a human rights practitioner, whoever you are, here's a paradigm for you to evaluate what you're doing with all of these questions, and here's things to consider. And I think that is, Nate, you're on top of this. This is great. So check that out, because I think Signal is a really great resource and something I've actually come back to since, in terms of a little bit of a sanity check to some degree. But I also think that those types of things need to be done in community, right? That you can't just do it as a company. And a lot of times since then too, this was always a hallmark of my conversations with our customers, our partners. I had the same conversation with UNICEF more recently of, do you actually want, to the open source question too, do you actually want to open source locations of schools all around the global South? Because I can see how that could go wrong. Can you guys see how that could go wrong? Or if you still want to do it as domain experts, let's talk about that and what those risks are and what's that mitigation plan and all that kind of good stuff. So And a lot of times for the companies, it's important because that's our reputation on the line, you know, as much as it is the impacts and the potential consequences of that behavior. So it's also, I think, really important for institutions to adopt that kind of lens too.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, guys, this has been great. I know we're almost at time. And so I just want to, maybe by way of kind of closing comments, I want to say thank you to everybody. I know it's late in the day for many folks, especially if we're East Coast or in other parts of the world outside of the US. And I really enjoyed kind of the questions and engagement here. So, and I'll also throw my contact information into the chat in case folks are interested in following up about anything. Happy to take more questions, or if you have specifics around what you're working on or things like that, happy to help there too. But yeah, so thank you everybody just for your time and your thoughtfulness.